A day like any other. The morning light streamed through the large glass windows of the downtown bank, painting the walls in soft hues of amber and gold. Outside, the city buzzed with the usual rhythm of bustling streets, cars honking, pedestrians walking with purpose, and the occasional street vendor calling out to passers-by. Inside the bank, the atmosphere was calm, almost serene, with the faint murmur of conversations and the click-clack of computer keys filling the air. It seemed like an ordinary day. The branch manager, Greg Thompson, sat behind his desk, carefully reviewing the daily reports. His office was lined with certificates and plaques that reflected his long tenure with the institution. He was a man of routine, someone who took pride in following the rules and ensuring everything went according to plan. He had worked his way up from the teller line, and now, as a branch manager, he thought he knew every nuance of the job. Today, however, would be different. As the clock ticked toward mid-morning, a woman walked through the bank's doors, carrying with her an aura of quiet confidence. She was dressed in a simple yet elegant business suit, her dark skin glowing under the soft lighting. She walked with a purpose, her heels clicking gently against the polished floor as she made her way toward the front counter. The young teller behind the counter, Amanda, looked up from her computer screen and smiled absent-mindedly at the newcomer. She was still fresh in her role, eager to please, but also unsure of herself. She had only been with the bank for a few months and had learned quickly that, in such a prestigious institution, appearances mattered, especially when it came to clients with large sums of money. Amanda's smile faltered when she saw the woman approaching. There was something about her presence that made Amanda hesitate, even though she couldn't quite place why. It was a feeling she had learned not to trust, one that had nagged at her whenever someone came in who seemed to stand out in a way she wasn't accustomed to. She quickly shook it off. She had a job to do. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I assist you today?" Amanda asked, her voice polite, but a little too formal. The woman nodded, her expression calm yet firm. "I'd like to make a deposit," she replied, pulling a check from her leather handbag and placing it on the counter. It was a large check, an amount that caught Amanda's eye immediately. She had seen many checks come and go in her short time at the bank, but this one seemed different. Amanda glanced at the check and then at the woman. She didn't recognize her, and the amount was far beyond what most clients deposited on a daily basis. For a brief moment, Amanda felt a flicker of doubt. Was it legitimate? Why was this woman depositing such a large sum? But before she could process her thoughts, the uncertainty was replaced by something else, a sense of discomfort, as if she were staring at something too complex for her to fully understand. The woman's calm demeanor only seemed to amplify Amanda's anxiety. She wasn't sure why, but something about the situation felt off. Amanda hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the check. She took a moment to examine it more closely, but the woman's presence, unspoken yet powerful, lingered in the air. The manager, Greg, had been watching from the corner of his office, as he often did when things seemed to take longer than usual. He had learned over the years that the flow of clients and transactions often required his attention, especially when large sums of money were involved. As Amanda's hesitation became more apparent, he stood up and walked towards the front counter. He hadn't expected to see anything out of the ordinary. The woman appeared to be an average customer, no different from the many high-net-worth individuals he regularly dealt with. But as he approached, he could see the uncertainty in Amanda's eyes. Something wasn't quite right, and Greg couldn't ignore that. He walked over with his usual confident stride, offering a smile to Amanda as he came to stand beside her. He glanced down at the check, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What seems to be the problem here?" Greg asked, his tone slightly condescending, as if the situation were beneath him. Amanda, still unsure, turned the check toward Greg, her voice soft. "There's something odd about this one, sir. It's a very large amount, and I don't recognize the name on the check." Greg didn't even look up at the woman, who was still standing patiently, waiting for something to happen. His gaze remained fixed on the check. He murmured, still scanning it. This check is far too large for our branch to process without additional verification. Turning to the woman, Greg finally spoke to her directly, though his tone lacked the warmth of genuine customer service. I'm afraid we'll need to verify this deposit with the issuing bank before we can proceed. I'll need you to provide further details about the source of these funds. The woman's expression remained neutral, but something shifted within her, a subtle change, barely noticeable to an untrained eye. But it was there. She had expected a certain level of professionalism when entering her own bank. After all, she wasn't just a customer. She was a part owner of this very institution, a founder, someone who had built the bank's empire from the ground up. But the manager's dismissive attitude, his assumption that she wasn't important enough to warrant immediate attention, was nothing new. It was an unwelcome reminder of the obstacles she had faced her entire life, both as a woman and as a black woman in a world that often refused to recognize her value. She stood there, looking at Greg with a calm yet resolute expression as he continued to speak, still oblivious to who she was. "That's not necessary," she said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of strength. "I am more than capable of providing the necessary verification. You just need to make the call." Greg didn't take her seriously. He was too absorbed in his own sense of authority. He smirked slightly, dismissing her suggestion as if she were just another client with an overblown sense of importance. "I'm afraid that's not how things work here, ma'am," he said, the condescension seeping into his words. "We'll need to follow standard procedure. You can't just walk in here and expect us to process a deposit of this size without verifying the source." For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The noise of the bustling bank faded into the background, and the only thing that mattered was the woman standing before Greg. She wasn't just a customer. She wasn't just anyone. She was the woman who had built this institution, the woman who had made the decisions that had led to this very branch's existence. And Greg, in his arrogance, didn't even recognize her. Her hands remained steady as she reached for her phone, an inner calm settling over her like a shield. This wasn't just about the check anymore. This wasn't even about the money. It was about the larger truth that so many people failed to see, that who she was, what she had built, and the success she had earned mattered, deserved recognition, and she was no longer willing to let anyone ignore that. The wheels were turning in her mind as she typed out a simple message, one that would begin to unravel the very system of assumptions that had led to this moment. But before she hit send, she looked directly at Greg. "Are you telling me," she asked, her voice measured and unwavering, "that this check is not good enough to be accepted because of who I am?" Greg paused, a flicker of doubt passing through him for the first time since the encounter began. The woman's question cut through his facade of authority, and for just a brief second, he wondered if he had made a mistake. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He had already decided who she was, and in that moment, he wasn't prepared to change his mind. The silence between them hung heavy, thick with unspoken truths, as the woman continued to watch him. It was in that silence, in that moment of tension, that the true battle began. The unseen struggle. The minutes that passed in silence felt like hours. The air in the bank seemed to thicken with every second, the tension mounting between the woman and Greg, who remained oblivious to the true weight of the situation. His stubbornness was palpable, almost as if he had wrapped himself in a cocoon of self-importance, where the world outside didn't matter. In his eyes, the woman in front of him was just another ordinary customer, a face in the crowd. Nothing more. But she knew better. She had seen this before. The condescending tone, the dismissive attitude, the assumption that because of her race, because of her gender, she was somehow less worthy of respect than her white counterparts. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a pattern, one she had encountered time and time again. Whether it was at business meetings, in boardrooms, or in the very institutions she had worked tirelessly to establish. The feeling of being underestimated, of being invisible to those who were supposed to recognize her value. But this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. Her hands moved with purpose as she tapped out a brief, clear message on her phone, her fingers swift but deliberate. Each word she typed felt like an arrow of truth, aimed directly at the core of a system that had allowed prejudice to linger, unchecked and unquestioned, for far too long. The message was simple, yet it carried a weight that Greg would soon come to understand all too well. Her eyes never left Greg's as she typed, her calm demeanor never faltering, as if her quiet strength was a shield against the storm of frustration that threatened to rise within her. She had built her career with this kind of composure, through years of overcoming obstacles, of proving herself over and over again, to people who had doubted her. But this was something different. This wasn't about her career, her assets, or the business she had built. This was about something deeper. It was about recognition, about the value of her being, not just the deposits she made or the profits she generated. She was tired of being seen as less than, tired of being forced to explain her worth in spaces where she had already proven herself. But this time, this moment, wasn't going to be a mere episode in her journey of resilience. No, this time, she was going to make sure it became a turning point. Greg's words had stung more than he could have imagined. The arrogance in his voice, the way he dismissed her before even knowing who she was, cut to the core. She felt a surge of anger, yes, but she refused to let it cloud her judgment. Instead, she channeled that anger into something powerful, something that would make a statement, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been belittled or dismissed for their race or gender. Greg was still standing there, unaware of the storm brewing within her. He had given her an opening, one that would be his undoing, and she knew it. But she also knew that she couldn't act recklessly. She had to be smart. The moment had to come when it would not only expose his ignorance, but also challenge a system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. She finished typing the message and hit send with a soft but deliberate press of her thumb. Her phone buzzed almost immediately with a reply from her personal assistant, confirming that she would be on her way, along with a vice president from the bank. The pieces were falling into place, and she knew that once the assistant and vice president arrived, Greg would have nowhere to hide. For a brief moment, she felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This was not a minor misunderstanding. This was not something that could be swept under the rug with a polite apology. This was a moment that had the potential to change everything. It was a chance to confront the deep-rooted biases that had festered within the banking industry and within society at large for far too long. As she closed her phone and looked back up at Greg, she saw the slight shift in his demeanor. He had noticed the message, the urgency behind it, and now the expression on his face had changed. No longer did he stand tall with the confidence of someone who thought he knew everything. Instead, there was a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in his armor. He stammered, trying to backpedal. There must be some mistake, Greg said, his voice wavering for the first time. I wasn't implying. I mean, we just need to follow procedure, you understand. But the woman, her gaze still fixed on him, knew that words alone wouldn't fix this. His attempts to backtrack, his feeble attempts to make it seem as though this was just a procedural issue, were transparent at best. She had seen this game played far too many times. I don't think you understand, she said, her voice steady, but carrying an edge of finality. This isn't about procedures. This isn't about rules. This is about respect. Her words were like a sharp knife, cutting through the layers of denial that Greg had wrapped himself in. You chose to assume that I couldn't possibly be someone who belongs here, that I don't deserve the same level of respect as your other clients. You've made a judgment about me based on something that has nothing to do with who I am or what I've achieved. Greg opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His face flushed with embarrassment as he realized that this wasn't going to be as simple as he had thought. He had misjudged her in the most fundamental way, and now he was about to face the consequences. The woman didn't look away. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, her presence now commanding the space. The truth was clear in her mind. This was bigger than the incident itself. This was about changing the way people saw others, especially those who had spent their lives fighting to be seen and heard. Greg began to sweat, his confidence now replaced with uncertainty. He didn't know how to fix this. He didn't know how to apologize for the mistake he had made, because deep down, he knew that the apology wouldn't be enough. Not this time. He couldn't undo the damage he had caused, and even if he could, it wouldn't erase the prejudice that had led him to make that judgment in the first place. Just then, the door to the bank swung open, and the assistant and vice president walked in. The moment they stepped into the room, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The vice president, a middle-aged man with graying hair and an air of authority, looked directly at the woman. His eyes widened slightly, but he said nothing. He could sense that something significant was happening, something far beyond the ordinary scope of business transactions. The assistant, a young woman with sharp eyes, moved quickly to the woman's side, acknowledging her with a respectful nod. The vice president, meanwhile, surveyed the room, his gaze falling on Greg, who was now standing by the counter, looking like he had just been caught in a lie. The woman didn't have to speak. The weight of the situation was already clear to everyone in the room. It was no longer just about the rejected check or the assumption of incompetence. It was about something much deeper. The systemic biases that had allowed this kind of behavior to persist unchecked for so long. "I've sent an email," the woman said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had taken control of the situation, "and I expect this issue to be resolved immediately." The vice president nodded slowly, his expression serious. He turned to Greg, his tone icy. "Greg, we need to have a conversation. Now." Greg looked around, clearly realizing that the situation was slipping from his control. He took a step back, but the damage had been done. There would be no escaping the consequences of his actions. For the woman, this moment wasn't about retribution. It wasn't about getting revenge. It was about something far more important. It was about making sure that no one, ever again, would have to go through what she had just experienced. No one should ever have to fight to be seen for who they truly were, simply because of how they looked or where they came from. As the vice president led Greg away, the woman stood there, a quiet fire burning in her chest. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was only the beginning. The awakening. The silence that followed was heavy, like the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. The bank, once full of the mundane hum of daily business, now felt like a courtroom, every corner seemingly holding its breath, waiting for the next move to be made. The woman, standing with the same calm composure, watched as Greg and the vice president exchanged words in the corner of the room, their conversation too quiet for her to overhear, but loud enough for the tension to seep into the very air they shared. She wasn't worried about what they were saying. She knew what was at stake. It wasn't about the money, the check, or even the institution's reputation. It was about something far more fundamental, the recognition of her humanity and her worth. The young assistant, who had remained close by, leaned in towards the woman. "Ma'am, would you like to step into my office while we sort this out?" she asked, her voice gentle but laced with an undertone of urgency. The assistant was young, but her eyes had already seen enough to know that something significant had just unfolded. The woman paused for a moment, then shook her head. "No, I'm staying right here. If anything, they need to see that I am not leaving until this is resolved." She gestured toward the desk in the back corner where Greg and the vice president were now engaged in a heated discussion. "Let's not make it seem like this is just a misunderstanding. Let them feel the weight of what's happening right now." Her words were soft but firm, the kind of conviction that left little room for doubt. The assistant gave a subtle nod, understanding the gravity of the situation. She knew, as well as the woman did, that this wasn't just about one manager's failure to process a deposit. It was about confronting the systemic issues that led to such lapses in judgment. It was about challenging the ingrained biases that define not only this institution but many others. In that moment, the woman realized that her decision to stay wasn't just for herself. It was for every person who had ever been made to feel invisible, unheard, and irrelevant because of the color of their skin or their gender. She wasn't merely standing up for herself. She was standing up for an entire community. Outside the door, the bank remained oblivious to the battle unfolding within. Customers came and went, none the wiser about what had just transpired. The woman knew, however, that this wasn't just about a single exchange. This was about sending a message, not only to Greg and the vice president, but to every person who worked behind the counters, who made decisions, who held power in the financial world. The message was simple but profound. You will not define me by your biases. As Greg and the vice president finally turned towards her, their faces telling the story of a conversation that had gone far from smoothly, she stood tall, never breaking eye contact with them. There was a sense of finality in her gaze, like a door that had been opened, and no matter how hard they tried to shut it again, the truth would remain exposed. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, her voice clear, carrying an undeniable weight of authority. Greg opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had just been told, in no uncertain terms, that his behavior had been not just unprofessional, but discriminatory. The vice president, who had a look of quiet disapproval on his face, said nothing at first, opting to give Greg a moment to collect his thoughts, or perhaps to confront the uncomfortable reality of what had just unfolded. For a long moment, neither Greg nor the vice president spoke. The silence in the room was deafening, punctuated only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. The woman, unwavering, continued to hold their gaze. She wasn't going to let them off the hook so easily. This wasn't about letting things slide. She wasn't here to offer forgiveness or appeasement. She was here to remind them, and everyone else, of what real accountability looked like. Finally, Greg cleared his throat, the words coming out awkwardly, as if they had been rehearsed but still felt wrong. I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to treat you in that way. It was a mistake." The vice president, standing just behind him, crossed his arms, his face stern. "A mistake, yes, but it goes beyond just a mistake, doesn't it, Greg?" His voice was low, controlled, but the weight of his words was unmistakable. "This isn't about a deposit or a check. This is about something much deeper. It's about a fundamental lack of understanding, a lack of respect. And most importantly, it's about assumptions you made based solely on appearance." Greg winced at the harsh truth in his superior's words, but he remained silent, unsure of how to respond. The woman didn't need him to apologize. She didn't need him to try and explain himself. She needed him to understand the larger issue at hand, something that was far bigger than him. The vice president turned to face her, his expression softening ever so slightly. I want to acknowledge that we have not handled this properly, ma'am, and I assure you this will be addressed, both for you and for any future clients who may experience something similar." The woman looked at him for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. She knew that action spoke louder than words. She had heard enough empty promises in her life to recognize the difference between a real commitment to change and a hollow attempt at placation. She wasn't interested in apologies. She wasn't interested in them telling her how sorry they were. She was interested in seeing real, tangible change. "You're right," she said, her voice firm, her tone unyielding. "But it's not enough to just say sorry. What will you do to make sure this never happens again? What systems, what policies are you putting in place to ensure that no one, especially not someone who looks like me, ever has to endure this kind of disrespect again?" The vice president was silent for a moment, the question lingering in the air like a challenge. It wasn't a question that could be easily brushed aside, and he knew it. "We'll have to review our training, especially with new employees. We'll start with a thorough diversity and inclusion course that highlights the importance of not making assumptions about people based on their appearance." The woman nodded, but her expression remained serious. That's a start, but it's not enough. It's not just about training people to be aware of their biases. It's about changing the entire culture. It's about making sure that people from diverse backgrounds are not only respected, but are seen as an integral part of the conversation from the beginning. From the boardroom to the front desk, the vice president nodded again, this time more thoughtfully. I understand. We'll also make sure that diversity is reflected at every level of the bank, not just in the employees we hire, but in the leadership positions as well. We need to change the way we think about success. The woman's eyes flickered with a glimmer of something approaching approval. Good, she said simply, because it's long past time that people like me, people who look like me, are not just tolerated but celebrated. We've earned our place at the table, and it's time for everyone to realize that. Gray, who had remained silent through much of the exchange, finally spoke up, his voice small. I'll do better. I promise. His voice cracked slightly, the weight of his own realization pressing down on him. He had made a mistake. No, not a mistake, but a gross misjudgment. And now he was left to confront the consequences of that judgment. The woman regarded him for a moment, her eyes unwavering. I hope so, Greg. I really do. But remember this. One apology, one promise isn't enough. You have to show me, and everyone else, that you've learned something from this. That you understand that people are not defined by their appearances, but by what they've accomplished, what they've worked for, and what they deserve. She turned away, signaling the end of the conversation. There was nothing more to say. Not yet. The wheels of change had been set in motion. And now it was up to Greg and the entire bank to prove that they were ready to follow through. The woman walked towards the exit, her heart pounding not with anger, but with a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't the victory she had expected. No, it was something deeper, a moment of awakening, not just for Greg and the vice president, but for the entire system they represented. This was only the beginning. The ripple effect. The room was quiet now, save for the soft hum of the bank's internal systems, processing the various mundane tasks of the day. The assistant, still standing nearby, watched the woman as she made her way toward the exit, the weight of the past few moments still lingering in the air. Greg, now pale and withdrawn, had retreated behind his desk, and the vice president, still standing by the counter, appeared lost in thought. The exchange had shaken all of them. As the woman's heels echoed through the marble floors, a shift in the atmosphere took place. It wasn't just that she had stood her ground in the face of prejudice, though that in itself was powerful. It was that in doing so, she had exposed something much larger, a flaw in the very foundation of how things were done, not only in this bank, but in every corporate and institutional space that had allowed itself to operate under assumptions of superiority and entitlement. Walking out of the branch, the woman felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, but it wasn't the feeling of triumph that most would expect. It wasn't the glee of winning or getting the last word. What she felt was something more profound, the beginning of a change she had longed for, but had never expected to see so clearly, so suddenly. She stepped outside the bank into the crisp midday air, feeling the cool breeze wrap around her. The sun shone bright above, but it was the glint of realization in her own heart that illuminated the path forward. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she had just shifted something deeply ingrained. The true significance of what had just happened wasn't going to be felt immediately. No, this wasn't a single moment of accountability. It was the beginning of a long, slow ripple that would spread across the bank, the community, and beyond. The first stone had been thrown into the water, and now the ripples would touch everything. Back inside the bank, the vice president had remained behind, still processing the woman's words, and Greg, whose arrogance had now been replaced by discomfort, was deep in thought, replaying every moment of their encounter in his mind. The shame he felt was palpable. For so long, he had simply gone through the motions, never truly questioning why certain people got preferential treatment or why others were so easily dismissed. He had assumed his position as the manager of a prestigious branch meant he had earned the right to make these decisions for others. But now, faced with the reality of what his actions had cost him, he could no longer deny the bitter truth. His mind raced, recalling the woman's unwavering gaze, the calm authority in her voice. She had done more than simply stand up for herself. She had forced him to confront the ugly truths he had spent so many years ignoring. He knew what his next steps had to be, even if he didn't have all the answers. He had to change. He had to prove that he wasn't the man he had been. The vice president, still standing with his arms crossed, let out a deep sigh. He had seen the manager falter many times before, during tough situations, in difficult meetings, but never like this. This wasn't just a failure to process a deposit. This was a failure to see the human being in front of him, to recognize her as someone of value, someone worthy of respect, just like any other high-profile client. "Greg," the vice president began slowly, his voice devoid of the usual condescension, "we need to have a conversation about your behavior." There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet acknowledgement that what had transpired was something that went beyond a managerial mistake. It was a deeper, more systemic issue that had to be addressed. "I know," Greg muttered, his voice heavy. "I don't even know what I was thinking. She wasn't just a customer. She was someone I should have known. I should have recognized her." He paused, his eyes clouded with regret. "I messed up. I didn't even take a moment to consider who she might really be. Instead, I just assumed. I made an assumption based on how she looked." The vice president gave a small nod. "We all make assumptions, Greg. That's part of being human. But the difference between someone who succeeds in this business and someone who doesn't is what they do when those assumptions are wrong. You've got to confront your own biases before they blind you to the bigger picture." Greg sank back into his chair, the weight of those words settling over him like a heavy blanket. "I thought I was above that," he admitted quietly. "I thought I'd earned my place here. But I didn't even think for 1 second about the possibility that she could be more than I imagined. That she could be more than just some customer with a big check." The vice president's expression softened. "It's not just about the check. It's about respect. And it's about understanding that everyone who walks through these doors is here for a reason. Your job isn't to judge them based on who you think they are or what you assume they might have. It's to treat them with the same level of professionalism you would give any other person, no matter their background, no matter their skin color." Greg nodded slowly, his gaze shifting down to his hands, clasped tightly on the desk. He realized, more than ever before, how much he had taken for granted in his life. How many doors had been opened for him simply because of his race, his background, his appearance. How many times had he been afforded opportunities because he fit into a world that made assumptions about people like him. And now, for the first time, he was seeing through the lens of the woman who had walked into the bank that morning. He wasn't just seeing a client. He was seeing a person, a woman who had fought to get to where she was, who had built something extraordinary despite the odds stacked against her. He had treated her like she was invisible, and that realization hit him harder than anything else. The vice president continued, his voice steady but firm. "Greg, I'm going to be honest with you. We can't continue like this. Not if we want to change the culture here. And not if we want to make sure that something like this never happens again. You're going to have to face the fact that you've lost her trust, and the trust of others who are watching. You're going to have to prove that you're willing to make real change." Greg sighed, rubbing his temples. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll take the training. I'll change my approach. I can't undo the past, but I can start with making sure I never make the same mistake again." The vice president gave him a long, hard look. "I hope so. Because if you don't, it won't just be your career that's on the line. It'll be the entire bank's reputation. We're here to serve everyone, not just the ones we're comfortable with. Remember that." Meanwhile, the woman was walking away from the bank, her mind still racing, but now with a sense of clarity. The events that had unfolded felt monumental, But she knew that this was only the first step in a long journey. It wasn't about one incident, one confrontation. It was about laying the foundation for a future where this kind of ignorance was no longer tolerated. She could already feel the change, the ripple effect spreading out from the bank and into the community. People would start talking about what had happened. They would begin to question their own assumptions, to reconsider the ways they viewed success, power, and authority. And it wasn't just going to be within the walls of this one bank. It would be everywhere. In boardrooms, in offices, in schools, and in homes. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the spark that would ignite a wider movement for change, a movement that was long overdue. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. As she walked through the city streets, her footsteps steady, her heart strong, she realized something. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or ignored. Every person who had had to prove themselves in spaces that were not designed for them. This was about creating a new world, one where respect, equality, and recognition were not just ideals, but realities. And this was only the beginning, the breaking point. The days following the incident at the bank unfolded with a quiet intensity. The woman's decision to challenge Greg and the entire banking system had reverberated far beyond the walls of that particular branch. News of the confrontation spread like wildfire through the bank's network, circulating through emails, whispered conversations, and even the occasional social media post. Some saw her as a trailblazer, a woman who had been forced to confront the subtle yet persistent biases of a financial institution, and had done so with dignity and power. Others, however, saw it as a disruption, a thorn in the side of a well-oiled machine that had been running smoothly for years. But in the midst of all this, one thing was clear. The woman had made an undeniable impact. Back at the bank, things were far from business as usual. The tension that had filled the room in the wake of her departure lingered like an unspoken truth. Greg, despite his apology and newfound resolve to change, couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation. He had been forced to confront his own ignorance, his own shortcomings, and for the first time in years, he found himself questioning everything he had assumed to be true about himself and the people around him. The vice president, who had always prided himself on maintaining the status quo, now found himself grappling with a sense of urgency. He knew that the woman's presence, her challenge, had exposed a deeper problem within the institution, one that extended far beyond Greg's actions. It was a problem that was endemic to the entire industry, and possibly society at large. For the first time in his career, he began to ask himself questions that he had long avoided. How many other clients had been dismissed or overlooked because of their appearance? How many women, particularly women of color, had walked through the bank's doors, only to be treated with suspicion, or worse, with outright disrespect? These questions were uncomfortable, but the vice president couldn't ignore them any longer. He had spent too many years in his comfortable bubble of privilege, unwilling to confront the systemic issues that had allowed these prejudices to persist. Meanwhile, the woman had gone back to her office, the weight of the experience still heavy on her shoulders. She wasn't one to seek attention or fame, but she knew that this was different. This wasn't just about her personal vindication. It was about something larger. It was about sending a message, not just to the bank, but to every institution, every business, and every person who had ever made judgments about her or others like her based on preconceived notions. That evening, as she sat in her office, she found herself reflecting on the long road that had brought her to this point. Her journey had not been an easy one. There had been countless moments when she had been told she wasn't enough, that she didn't belong. She had been underestimated, discounted, and marginalized at nearly every turn, especially in the male-dominated, predominantly white world of banking. But through all of it, she had never given up. She had fought for her place, for her right to exist in these spaces, and now she had a chance to challenge the very systems that had tried to keep her out. Her phone buzzed with a notification, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was an email from her personal assistant. She opened it and read, "We need to talk." The vice president of the bank wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. There are some things they would like to discuss about the incident and how we can move forward. The message was simple, but it felt like a turning point. She knew that the meeting could go in many directions. The bank could simply offer her a token apology, a few promises of change, and hope that things would return to normal. Or they could actually do something meaningful, something that would change the culture, not just at this branch, but across the entire institution. As much as she wanted to believe that the meeting would lead to tangible change, she had learned long ago that change was never as simple as it seemed. Even the best intentions often failed to move beyond empty words. She would have to remain vigilant. She couldn't afford to trust too easily, not when she knew how easily institutions could backslide when faced with the discomfort of real change. The next morning, she walked into the bank's headquarters, her steps purposeful, her heart calm. As she entered the vice president's office, she was greeted with a warm but formal handshake. The vice president, a man who had always maintained a sense of distance from the frontline employees, now seemed almost apologetic, his expression carefully neutral. "Good morning," he said, gesturing for her to sit. His tone was respectful, but she could sense the underlying tension. This was a man who had spent years avoiding these kinds of conversations, and now he was being forced to confront them head-on. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," the vice president began, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of uncertainty. "We've been reviewing what happened at the branch, and I've been speaking with the staff and management team about the incident. I want to start by saying, once again, how sorry we are for the way you were treated. It was unprofessional, and frankly, it was unacceptable." The woman nodded, not giving a sign of approval or disapproval. She had heard these kinds of apologies before, empty words that held little weight in the face of real systemic issues. But the vice president continued, "This situation has made us realize that there is a much larger issue at play here. We need to reevaluate our entire approach to diversity and inclusion. We need to understand why things like this happen and how we can prevent them in the future." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. "And what exactly are you planning to do about it?" The vice president looked at her, his eyes slightly widening. It was clear that he had expected her to be more receptive to the apology, more forgiving. But she wasn't interested in empty promises. She had fought too long, too hard, for her voice to be heard, and she wasn't about to let this moment slip by without a real commitment to change. "We've already started the process," he said. "We're implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, not just for frontline staff, but for management as well. We're also launching a new initiative to diversify our leadership team. We're committed to hiring more people of color, particularly in senior roles. We understand that without diversity in leadership, nothing will truly change." She raised an eyebrow. "That's a good start. But it's not enough. This isn't just about hiring more people from diverse backgrounds. This is about changing the culture from the inside out. It's about making sure that no one who walks through the doors of this bank is ever treated as less than because of how they look. It's about empowering your employees to recognize their biases and act on them before they make the mistakes that lead to situations like the one that happened at the branch." The vice president nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He was no longer speaking from a place of defensiveness. Instead, he seemed to be listening, truly listening. "We're also going to be conducting an internal audit of all our branches to assess how our policies and procedures might inadvertently discriminate against clients based on their race, gender, or appearance," he said. "We want to make sure that we are truly fostering an environment of equality, not just for our employees, but for our customers as well." The woman sat back in her chair, crossing her arms as she took in his words. It was the first time since entering the room that she felt a flicker of cautious optimism. "Good," she said finally. "But I want to see the results. I want to see the action behind those words, and I want to be involved in that process, to make sure that the changes you're making are real and not just for show." The vice president met her gaze, his eyes now filled with determination. "You have my word. We will follow through. and we would be honored to have your input as we move forward." As the meeting came to a close, the woman stood up, shaking the vice president's hand firmly. She could sense the sincerity in his words, but she also knew that the real work was just beginning. It would take time, effort, and dedication to truly change the culture at the bank. And if they were serious about it, they would have to go much deeper than just policy changes and diversity training. But for now, this was a step forward. A step toward the kind of world where people like her, people who had worked tirelessly to build something, would no longer have to fight to be seen as equals. She left the meeting with a sense of purpose, knowing that her journey, her fight, was far from over. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and she would be there, pushing forward every step of the way. The road to transformation. The days after the meeting with the vice president were both thrilling and exhausting. The woman had always been driven, but now, with the knowledge that real change could be within reach, she felt an intense focus and determination that pushed her forward. As the weeks passed, the bank's response began to take shape. The vice president kept his promise, sending regular updates about the steps they were taking to address the systemic issues she had uncovered. However, for all the progress they claimed to be making, the woman knew that action would be the ultimate measure of their sincerity. Words could be easily spoken, and promises could be easily made, but only through tangible, visible changes could she know for sure whether the bank was truly committed to transforming its culture. As she sat in her office late one evening, reviewing the first round of diversity and inclusion training materials that the bank had sent her, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She had built her empire from the ground up, overcoming not just the barriers of race and gender, but also the limitations placed upon her by a society that often viewed her as other. And now, in this moment, she was confronting not only the personal battles she had fought, but the larger, more insidious systems of inequality that ran deep within every part of the world she moved through. For the first time, she began to see the real scope of her power. It wasn't just about financial success or influence. It was about the ability to spark real change. She had always known she had a voice, but now she understood the magnitude of that voice. She wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a force of nature, capable of shaking the very foundations of an institution that had for so long turned a blind eye to the inequalities that existed within its walls. She leaned back in her chair, looking out the window at the city skyline. It was a familiar view, one she had seen countless times, but tonight it felt different. The city, with its steel and glass towers, seemed to hold endless possibilities. The world, she realized, was hers to shape. A few weeks after the meeting, the woman was invited to speak at a regional conference on diversity and inclusion in the corporate world. It was a huge opportunity, one that could help her push her mission for change into even greater visibility. It was an invitation she couldn't turn down. She spent the next several days preparing for the event, carefully crafting a speech that would address the broader issues of racial and gender inequality, not just in banking, but in all industries. Her message was clear. Systemic change was not just a nice-to-have. It was essential to the future success and integrity of any organization. The day of the conference arrived, and the woman stood backstage, her heart beating steadily as the time to take the stage drew closer. The room was filled with business leaders, executives, and employees from all walks of life, many of them white, many of them men. She knew the odds were stacked against her, but that didn't matter. She had a story to tell, and she was going to tell it. As she stepped onto the stage, the applause was polite but somewhat hesitant. The audience didn't yet know what to expect, but as soon as she spoke, the room fell into a deep silence. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "I'm here today, not just as a businesswoman, but as someone who has spent much of my life being told that I wasn't good enough because of my skin, because of my gender, because of the ways I was seen by others. And I know I'm not alone." The room was still. She could feel the eyes of the audience on her, many of them already uncomfortable, perhaps sensing that this wasn't going to be the typical corporate speech. But that didn't deter her. She had something to say, and she wasn't going to let anything stand in her way. I've built my career in an industry that was never built for people like me. And along the way, I've had to fight every single day to prove my worth, not just as a woman, but as a black woman, in a world that rarely takes the time to look beyond the surface. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room. She could see the discomfort on some faces, the embarrassment on others. But she didn't flinch. She was used to being uncomfortable. But what I've learned, she continued, is that the system is broken. It was never designed to be inclusive. It was never designed to recognize the value of people who are different. The system has been working perfectly if you happen to fit the mold. But the truth is, that mold is too narrow. And that's why we see women, particularly women of color, being overlooked, passed over, and disrespected in industries and spaces where they belong. She could feel the room starting to shift, the tide turning ever so slightly. She wasn't sure if they understood yet, but she was going to make them. We cannot continue to accept this as normal. We cannot keep pretending that the small, incremental changes we make to fix this issue will be enough. It's not enough to hire a few people from underrepresented groups. It's not enough to talk about diversity and inclusion without making true, lasting changes in the way we operate. She looked directly at the audience now, her eyes sharp, her voice unwavering. It's not enough to look at people like me and think that we are exceptions to the rule. We are not exceptions. We are part of the rule. We are part of the future of business. And if you want to thrive in this new world, you have to recognize that your system, your culture, your way of thinking needs to change. The silence that followed was pregnant with tension. The room was no longer just listening. It was absorbing her words, and she could tell that some people were beginning to reflect on their own actions, their own biases, their own role in perpetuating the very system she was challenging. She didn't let the moment go unnoticed. "I'm here today not because I want your pity or your sympathy," she said, her tone shifting slightly, softer but still filled with purpose. "I'm here because I want your commitment. I want your commitment to making real change. I want you to promise me, and to promise everyone else in this room, that you will do more than just pay lip service to inclusion and diversity. You will act. You will change. You will create spaces where everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, has a seat at the table." The crowd was quiet for a moment longer before a slow, hesitant applause began, growing louder as it spread. The woman stood tall, her heart pounding with a sense of accomplishment. But she knew this was only the beginning. The impact of her speech was immediate. Articles were written, interviews were conducted, and companies began reaching out to her, wanting to discuss how they could implement the changes she had outlined. The woman had become a symbol, not just of success, but of the kind of leadership that could drive real transformation. As the days passed, she found herself at the center of a movement, one that was bigger than any individual effort. People from all over the world were watching, listening, and beginning to demand change. Back at the bank, the vice president called her again, this time with a different tone. "I want to thank you," he said. "Your speech made an impact, and I think it's time we take a deeper look at how we can involve you in shaping the future of our company." The woman smiled, but she knew that the real work was just beginning. Change, true change, was not something that could be achieved in a single speech or a single policy. It was something that would require continuous effort, constant vigilance, and above all, unwavering commitment. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that the road ahead could lead to something better. For her, for the bank, and for the world. The journey had been long and difficult, but the woman knew that she had only just begun. And she would not stop until the world she had envisioned, a world of true equality and respect, became a reality.